All right, folks, and we're back. Another episode of Monday Morning Mailbag. I have my colleague Noah here today. Noah, how's the weekend?
It's good. Finally recovered.
Covered. Well, listen, folks, this past week I had the opportunity to join MassBio for their lab facilities and operations summit slash working group and was a part of a conversation about how we can make laboratory facilities and operations more sustainable. And of course, being a part of the conversation, a lot of the discussion was focused on plastics, recycling, and why circularity specifically is sustainable. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to open up this conversation to the Monday morning mailbag, to tease out some of the highlights from that discussion. And so I'll be passing it over to my colleague Noah, who's put in a lot of legwork to help visualize some of these themes that are quite consequential to understanding decarbonization, plastic circularity, etc. So Noah, over to you.
You stole my thunder. I was going to tell people that I'm a visual learner, and that's why I put together some graphics to help. But James is right. We talked after his meeting. It was a great conference with a lot of very knowledgeable people participating. And we figured we were going to kind of take that discussion and all the questions that were brought up, and we're going to put it into a very quick presentation. But the whole idea is really understand what makes recycling sustainable, what makes circularity different, and what are the solutions out there and why there can be an opportunity cost in terms of not pursuing circularity when it is known to be possible. And so I'm going to pull my slide deck here in a second. There we go. Okay. So I think a lot of people think about recycling as a synonymous term with sustainable. And that's actually not true. There's actually examples of efforts to recycle out there that have failed. And they've failed because when measured on their total impact on the environment and on energy consumption, they were actually worse than continuing to use single-use technologies. An example of that would be multi-layer film recycling with
Mm.
municipal goods and food packaging. It is just too difficult to make a high enough quality product with the energy requirements that go into separating that material to produce a viable product in a sustainable way. Pyrolysis is another example. These technologies are largely phased out of the market or are waiting for technological advancements that reduce the total impact of the actual process itself to make them viable again. So just because something is recycling does not mean it is sustainable. And within that, just because something is recycling doesn't mean it is the most sustainable. There's very different types of recycling solutions out there with various different environmental impacts. And we're kind of going to break down the components of recycling that produce sustainable outcomes and evaluate them under the context of circularity. So I want you to think in terms of resource conservation, waste reduction, and fossil fuel displacement. What I mean by that is recycling promotes resource conservation because if you can reuse something more than one time, you need less of it. That's very intuitive. Waste reduction, again, very clear. If something is not going to landfill and instead coming back into a supply chain that can be reused again, it fundamentally has more utility and therefore produces less waste. And finally, fossil fuel displacement. This one is specific to plastics largely, and I want you to think about it in terms of plastic recycling. But because plastics are made from fossil fuels, you need to think about how can I use as little fossil fuel as possible to make as many products as possible and get as much productivity and utility out of those products as possible before they're ultimately condemned to waste. So those are kind of the three pillars of what makes recycling sustainable.
So
So
Noah,
yeah,
before you jump ahead there, I think that in our experience, we've seen this time and time again that maybe prior to the last 5 years, a lot of the laboratory sustainability journey has focused on plastic because it was viewed as a waste problem. In our conversations with customers, we see that there is this greater acknowledgement now that these materials are not just a waste issue for the pharmaceutical and life science companies that we service. They're recognizing that it's also a carbon problem. And that links back to what you just said about that fossil fuel displacement. Whether it's a scope 3 emission, it's all linking back to the fact that our supply chain is rooted in these plastics. They're made from fossil fuels. And really, by addressing these three pillars, that's what makes recycling sustainable, not just waste reduction.
you're absolutely right. And the short way to put it is the rate at which we use plastic makes it not just a waste problem, but a climate problem. It actually is one of the largest sources of CO2 emissions for our industry, which is why it's so critical that we address the issue. So I also want to highlight that within the world of recycling, there is a gold standard, circularity. People use this term a lot. People apply it to virtually everything, and it's kind of losing its meaning. And I want to kind of define it in this presentation so we understand what is the standard of circularity, why is it different, and why is it more sustainable. So circularity, true circularity, means creating a closed ecosystem with the same consumers, the same recyclers, the same reprocessors, the same manufacturers. That is critical because that means that the products you are remaking out of recycled content are going to the same consumers who recycled them in the first place. And that leads to the second point, which is recovery rates. Circularity is more sustainable than other forms of recycling because the person who recycled a pipette tip box, if given another pipette tip box made out of recycled content, has a very high likelihood of recycling that recycled pipette tip box again. That is one of the most important things you can do for creating positive environmental impacts because it means each of those pipette tip boxes that get recycled displace more and more and more fossil fuels. That harkens back to the slide we were talking about earlier. So circularity is a closed ecosystem that promotes high recovery rates. This last one is super philosophical, but bear with me. Incentive alignment. If manufacturers in a circular system are reliant upon recycled feedstocks from their consumers to manufacture goods, they are incentivized to make it easier for their consumer to recycle their products. They design for circularity. They design for recyclability. This incentive alignment is the positive feedback loop. It is the flywheel effect that continues to perpetuate a more efficient and sustainable system over time. James, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that what's clear to me in this section is that it's industry-wide coordination from different players within different sectors. And through that coordination layer, you achieve circularity. So I really love what this highlights, which is the importance of collaboration. When you align incentives, as you're pointing out, you're going to get participation, not just from the manufacturers, but the actual consumers slash generators of this waste, and then ultimately the downstream recyclers. A lot of the success of recycling is driven by demand for sustainable products or services, or for that circular resin and feedstock. We can definitely tease this out into its own separate Monday morning mailbag, but that incentive that's created for design to circularity is something that we're particularly very excited about. And that's ultimately what will compound the impact of circularity over time.
So, as a bookend, we think back to that, first slide where we're talking about resource conservation, waste reduction, and fossil fuel displacement. And even though we spent a lot of time kind of getting into the weeds about it, you can fundamentally think of circularity as the perfect, like the platonic form of recycling because it optimizes resource conservation, it maximizes waste reduction, and it promotes the greatest amount of fossil fuel displacement. Barring changing the resource you're using to a more renewable alternative, this is the most sustainable way to manage plastic for the life science industry. Now, everything we're talking about is rooted in science and rooted in measurability, and therefore needs to be provable. And so James and I are always talking about the virtues of life cycle assessments. They are imperfect tools, but necessary tools for measuring the impact of a process, and most importantly, defining the scope of what you are comparing yourself to. And so when you're thinking about measuring sustainability, you need to ask 3 questions. What are you replacing? How are you replacing it? And can you prove it? So we need to think in terms of what are you replacing, both on a product level and on a resource level. And so let's use the example we've been using consistently throughout this presentation. If you recycle pipette tip boxes or just general laboratory plastics into more laboratory plastics, the product you are replacing is a laboratory product that virtually 100% of the time would have been manufactured out of virgin resin. So the product you are replacing is clearly defined. It is a laboratory product. And the resource you are replacing is pretty clearly defined, which is virgin plastic.
Hmm.
How are you replacing it? For the purpose of this presentation, we're only going to talk about different forms of mechanical recycling because we will need to have a fully separate Monday morning podcast about advanced recycling, pyrolysis, enzymatic recycling to really understand what the LCAs say about those. But for the purpose of this presentation, mechanical recycling, according to cross-sectional literature on LCAs throughout multiple different industries, is almost always more sustainable than producing a product out of virgin plastic. Again, there are exceptions, but in general, mechanical recycling is pretty low impact in terms of energy and in terms of emissions, and in terms of being more sustainable, it almost always is. Finally, can you prove it? In order to prove that that a recycled content or a recycled product is offsetting the environmental impact of a less sustainable alternative, you have to prove that the less sustainable alternative would have been used had you
Mm.
displaced it. It sounds like a tongue twister, but it basically means you can't take recycled plastic and make an art installment out of it, or a new fidget spinner that never existed before and there was no predefined market for. Because otherwise, you're just kind of inventing new demand for more plastic in the market. You're not replacing virgin plastic in the market. And so it is critical that you can prove that what you are replacing was necessary, has market utility and demand, and was going to be made out of virgin material, whether or not you recycled it or not.
I think that point is worth underscoring, and it comes back to the need to demonstrate that a product would have otherwise been purchased whether or not the recycled product was made. And this loops back to what I'm sure you'll discuss in greater detail, which is equilibrium and disequilibrium associated with circular versus non-circular recycling solutions.
We will, in fact, get into that. So let's talk about true circularity. And in order to kind of understand the differences, we're actually going to use two examples out there of downcycling, which is producing a tabletop waste bin, and plastic lumber. We're using these as examples to kind of show you how to conceptualize the difference between true circularity and what are otherwise just traditional recycling and downcycling solutions. So James was talking about a balanced equation. This is one of the additional virtues of circularity, is that you are matching supply and demand. And so think about it like this. The average academic lab, small academic lab, is going to consume between 3,000 and 5,000 pipette tip boxes every year. Discounting the marginal yield loss in processing, mechanically processing and recycling that material, you can produce 4,000 pipette tip boxes out of the feedstock of recycled 4,000 pipette tip boxes. And practically speaking, a lab that consumes 4,000 pipette tip boxes in 1 year will likely need another 4,000 pipette tip boxes in the following year. This is a balanced recycling ecosystem. You have a single-use system and the waste product of a single-use system plugging into the feedstock of the manufacturing of another single-use system with similar consumers and similar manufacturers. Let's talk about an imbalanced equation. Now, again, we use these as examples to understand what is circularity and what isn't circularity. So you think about that same small academic lab consuming 4,000 pipette tip boxes in a year. You can produce 800 tabletop receptacles with 4,000 pipette tip boxes. The laboratory that consumes 4,000 pipette tip boxes on a yearly basis is probably 2 to 3 bench spaces, maybe 4 scientists actively working 5 days a week, 7 days a week. That lab does not need 800 tabletop receptacles per year. And they definitely don't need 800 tabletop receptacles year over year over year. That is an imbalanced equation. And while it represents a form of downcycling, when you think about the scalability of the system and of the solution, it doesn't. And so that is why it is not a circular solution, not only because it's producing a product that is not the same value and market utility as a pipette tip box, but also because it doesn't serve at the same appropriate rate and balanced rate the demand of the product that it is made from. So we're going to harken back to that question of what are you replacing as well. And again, there's a product level and a resource level of this. So at the product level, true circularity, as we talked about, replaces the same product or a product of equivalent value, ideally within the same supply chain with the same manufacturer and consumer. And in addition to that, the product being replaced has to have true market utility. It has to have been consumed or used or demanded had you have not made a recycled version of it. And so at the resource level, it's pretty straightforward. You have to, true circularity is when plastic replaces virgin fossil fuel derived feedstocks, and it has to have been established that that virgin material would have gone into the product you are replacing. So again, for circularity in the laboratory, producing more lab consumables from lab consumables, this is pretty straightforward. At the product level, we're replacing lab consumables. At the resource level, we're replacing virgin material because those are the defined, provable inputs to our industry.
Can I zoom out a bit, Noah? Right now, we're using pipette tip boxes as an example, but you all know that when you zoom out, this expands far beyond one plastic widget. This is a demonstration of what can be done with packaging components, products across our industry, reintegrating that material back into that circular supply chain, displacing unnecessary fossil fuel derived virgin resins. These are products that are in demand every single year, making a more sustainable supply chain where these products are designed for recyclability, designed for sustainability, and manufactured with that circular content. Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, again, the pipette tip box is the visual placeholder that represents the primary polymers driving our laboratories, which are GPPS, polypropylene, HDPE, and PET. So thinking about what you're replacing, you also have to be able to prove it. Otherwise, you can't reliably provide a consumer data. And so in the context of a waste bin, a tabletop waste bin, you may make the claim, I am replacing a sharps container. But let's look closer at that. What is required to replace a sharps container? Well, there's very specific manufacturing requirements for replacing that product. If you don't meet those requirements, the consumer cannot use that product as a sharps container. And then you run the risk of actually just producing a novel widget with no predefined demand in the market. And as we talked about, if you can't prove you're displacing an existing product with market utility and predefined demand, you are just creating a new market with new demand and therefore new emissions and new environmental impacts.
Said very simply, this all ties back to the pre-existing demand for that product in the market, regardless if you had been there to produce your product with recycled content. Only through a demand that exists are you able to claim the environmental benefit of slotting in your recycled resin to displace, hopefully, a virgin plastic. So this is very, very much so defined by the demand of the product.
All right. Now let's talk in terms not of a waste receptacle, but in terms of kind of the gold standard for downcycling, which is the catch-all, which is plastic lumber. Industrial goods like plastic lumber are very complicated in terms of the displacement question because you have to consider all the market factors that go into the production of plastic lumber and what it is that you're claiming to actually replace. Now, a lot of times, LCAs for plastic lumber will claim that they're displacing virgin plastic. A lot of times, those claims are dubious because there's already market analysis out there that suggests that anywhere between 25 to 75% of the plastic being used in today's US-based manufacturing plastic lumber is already recycled content. And so if it's already established that we are using low-end recycled content, again, coming from municipal MRFs to feed this industry, does it make sense to take high-end premium quality laboratory plastics to feed that industry? I would say no. And the LCAs that basically claim that this type of plastic, this type of feedstock is going into the production of plastic lumber that is displacing renewable forestry. The data on that is less compelling and has a lot to do with the perceived longevity of the plastic lumber compared to something like cedar planks and the treatments that you have to do to cedar planks. And again, tons of studies about microplastic and soil samples and local environments indicate that the results are mixed. We don't really know how much more sustainable plastic lumber made out of recycled content is than a cedar plank.
Let me hop in there. I think this example and the prior one with a waste receptacle both highlight the importance of understanding the existing market dynamics for the demand of those products and whether or not your recycling process to slot recycled content may be competing with another feedstock, may actually already be a recycled resin or recycled content, and how that impacts the sustainability of the overall recycling process. If these products already are manufactured with recycled content today, and your recycling process is competing for access and offtake in that supply chain, it ultimately is a lower value from a sustainability perspective as compared to producing that product with the existing offtake and recycled content that is sourced through that supply chain today.
I think this presentation really kind of boils down to highlighting the opportunity cost of not choosing circularity when it is technologically and practically feasible to do so. There are always going to be situations in which downcycling is the best solution. We can talk about the 25 to 50% of total plastic coming from laboratories that is infectious, that is hazardous, that would be very difficult to bring back into the production of laboratory products again. It may be the case that the best solution for that material is to go into plastic lumber and get one additional use cycle out of the resource before it's burned or buried. That may be the case. But for non-regulated, non-hazardous, high quality, laboratory grade plastics, leaving the laboratory as waste, to not take advantage of an opportunity to infuse that resource into a circular economy has a tremendous opportunity cost. We should be collectively interested in making as much of the plastics we use on a daily basis available for second, third, fourth use cycles as we can, because that is the most sustainable way we can manage the most carbon intensive resource coming from our laboratory.
When scientists, lab ops folks, EH&S folks that are championing sustainability, when they have the opportunity to address their plastic waste issue, choosing to embrace a downcycling solution is a massive missed opportunity. As you pointed out, when all things are possible technologically to close the loop, it's a missed opportunity because you as a scientist are not only able to now address a waste problem, but fundamentally impact upstream as these manufacturers now are producing products that are designed for sustainability that incorporate this recycled content, and downstream as you're addressing the waste problem here. There's an opportunity cost to doing so, and all things being equal, if price is the same, if operationally this is feasible, not choosing to engage in a closed loop recycling solution is missing out on the opportunity to collaborate across the industry to close the loop.
I love that. The act of recycling doesn't have to just be a benevolent act by a single consumer with their singular product. By engaging in a circular system, you are influencing upstream and downstream supply and demand and creating systemic change. I love that idea.
Well, folks, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on the Monday Morning Mailbag, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
See you next time.